Part two. Hammurabi and his ruled for a couple of centuries, but they were replaced eventually by the Hittites, another Mesopotamian group that came in. They were replaced by the very powerful Assyrians, who are legendary for their military prowess. These guys would tunnel under your walls and tear them down. They would, in full armor, they would float across rivers on inflated sheep bladders. They were military geniuses, pretty ruthless, and they just knew the art of war. At its high point, they were ruled by a man named King Ashurbanipal. Not only was he a warrior king, which all these early kings were warriors, he ruled from the front. He also built a very famous library that housed it saved the Epic of Gilgamesh from the Sumerians that we're familiar with and we'll read more about in class. Let me go back to early, when you're talking about the first Sumerians, and I missed this in the first part, the early government style was tribal in nature, tribal council. Your elders would get together and they would decide what was most important for the city. But this tended to take a while because everybody had to get on board, they had to agree with each other, and that takes a little bit. So in times of crisis, a man called a king would be appointed, and the king would make all these very quick snap decisions. And over time, these kings, of course, began to hold on to the power even when there wasn't a crisis. And then eventually they would actually pass that power down to their eldest son. So that's where monarchy comes from, and I failed to mention that earlier on. Alright, so by the year 1300 BCE, the Assyrians had extended their rule to most of southwest Asia. They were a growing power. King Ashurbanipal actually called himself the king of the universe, so he was not a very modest man, of course. Now, culturally speaking about the Mesopotamians, they are the earliest form of writing that we found. They're cuneiform, which is a wedge-shaped. You kind of have this pen called a stylus, and you just kind of made these weird chicken scratch-looking things. And they used it, of course, for record-keeping. That was the main thing. But eventually they would create stories such as the epics of Gilgamesh. The Mesopotamians also progressed from bronze metallurgy to iron metallurgy. Iron is superior to bronze, just as bronze is superior to stone. If you're out there brandishing bronze weapons against an army that is fielding iron weapons, you're going to lose. It's just a much superior metal. Mesopotamians also made use of the wheel. As you guys can imagine, you're able to carry goods over long distances much more efficiently with the wheel. They also used the sail, which is incredibly important, and both of these inventions and innovations would actually change human history. Mesopotamians had a profound influence not only just there in Mesopotamia, but in areas surrounding Mesopotamia. The early Hebrews, also known as the Israelites, they were influenced by Mesopotamia. They adopted some of the Mesopotamian beliefs. The early Hebrews are very important to us because they gave us the idea of monotheism. Mono means one, meaning they believed in one God. Their God's name was Yahweh. They are the Jews of today. The ancient Hebrews were. Prior to this time, all the ancient peoples believe in polytheism, meaning many gods. When we'll talk about Egypt and China and all these, you're talking about many gods in India. The early scriptures of the Hebrews, the Israelites, the Jews, associate all three of those together. They were gathered up and put in a book called the Torah. That is the Jewish holy book. Just like the Christian holy book is the Bible, and the Muslim holy book is the Quran. The main two kings you need to know about the ancient Hebrews was King David. If you remember the story in the Bible of David and the giant, that's the same man, King David. He founds this line of kings. King Solomon, his son, very, very powerful, one of the wealthiest men in history, known for his wisdom. Both these two men were not enough to keep the Hebrews from being conquered. They would eventually split into two kingdoms. It would be Israel in the north and Judah to the south. But both of these would be conquered by the Babylonians and those who would come after them. But still, over the long-term big picture, the ancient Jews the Hebrews were very influential in early Christianity, and Islam. The next group we're going to talk about is the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians are some of history's greatest sailors. They were in the northeast corner of Africa, modern-day Lebanon. They didn't really have a land empire. They were just a collection of city-states that their main focus was trade, and they dominated Mediterranean trade because they were the best sailors. They didn't have good places for food, so they could only survive through trade. The Mesopotamians were well known for a couple of things that you need to know. The red purple dye, which eventually would become the symbol of royalty because it was so expensive, and of course their shipwrights, their shipbuilding techniques, and lastly and most importantly their alphabet. Up to this time, to say a word, you had to create an entire symbol for just that word. What the Phoenicians did was they used symbols that would represent syllables, which you guys are familiar with, and you link them together and it creates words. The Phoenician alphabet had 22 letters instead of our 26. They didn't have vowels. Eventually the Greeks would adapt the Phoenician alphabet and it would become what we know today as the alphabet. Alph and bet are both Greek words. Okay, lastly, Indo-Europeans, immensely important. They are the mother tongue for languages such as German, Spanish, Sanskrit, many others, but most importantly to you, English. This is our mother tongue. Indo-Europeans, English derives from the same places that German and some other language, and Spanish does. The Indo-Europeans are the first ones to domesticate the horse. Early peoples ate the horse. That's what they did. The horse was a food source. Indo-Europeans looked at the horse and said, beast of burden. And this made them very powerful in warfare. Horse-drawn chariots. Indo-Europeans brought iron technology, and they were unstoppable on the battlefield with their horse-drawn chariots. Some of these groups of Indo-Europeans, such as the Aryans, considered themselves superior to other peoples. Hittites were Indo-Europeans. They toppled the Babylonian Empire, the mighty Babylonian empires. And Indo-Europeans would scatter throughout the world, even as far east as China. We have found bodies of mummified people in ancient China that were red-haired and light-skinned. Okay, so big picture on this, Mesopotamians are our first empires, our first great complex society. It gives us our first written language, cuneiform, and they won't be the only ones, of course. We'll talk about the Chinese, the Indians, and the Egyptians. All of these cultures pretty much develop independently. None of this would be possible without the agricultural revolution, so keep that in mind. People have to have time to stop and think to be able to come up with big ideas such as the wheel and the cell. They can't just be struggling to survive every day. Okay, that concludes Chapter 2.